Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. That is an excerpt from Alfred Lord Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, which you see depicted here, and it's an essential part, I think, of understanding the Western genre. Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and tonight I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the research I did into the Western and what I thought of it as I was crafting the story of Hexwood. The Western is a really interesting genre. It's set in a specific time and a specific place. And you have to really understand that time and place to understand the world that people were telling stories about and how that reflected on the themes, on the characters, on the obstacles they had to overcome, what they were thinking about. These are all very important parts of the Western. And although the Battle of Balaclava was fought in Russia by the British and the Russians, it has an interesting element of it. Of course, the Old West was not in a vacuum. It took place in a world that was rapidly changing. Of course, industrialization was taking over. Modern warfare was introducing more powerful and faster firing forms of firearms. Traditional battlefield roles were changing a lot. You couldn't fight in the same way. You couldn't make your living in the same way. It was a very tumultuous time. Ooh, I can talk, really. And it was difficult for people to deal with it. They had a lot of questions about their place in the world. At the same time, there were not really frontiers anymore. All of the world was mapped. People knew where they were in the world. There was no part on the map where there might be dragons, although they hadn't explored all of South America and Africa yet. They were still poking into those unexplored regions. They kind of had a grasp on what the world was like. There was no longer a danger of sailing off the edge of the world. And it really changed the way you looked at the world, the way you looked at finding your place in it. You could no longer just set off across the horizon if you couldn't hack it where you were. And I think that really that we see pop culture begin to reflect that, starting with Alfred Lord Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, which was published in 1854. Really just a month and a half, I believe, after the Battle of Balaclava. And it's interesting, the perspective it gives us. It shows that people were no longer really thinking of soldiers in an idealized sense. Of course, the poem idealizes the 600 men of the Light Brigade. It honors them as brave men, but it also points out that they were essentially wasted. They were ordered to attack cavalry in place, or excuse me, an artillery emplacement that they didn't need to. It was a miscommunication. It was an error, and they went and they died for an error. And it's noble, but it's very tragic. Most poetry, most literature reflecting on the battlefield at this time tended to present the idealized leader and the idealized soldier in the hopes of making people more motivated when they inevitably had to go to war. But with the Charge of the Light Brigade, that began to change. And that was reflected again later in other pieces of pop culture. Look at the Red Badge of Courage. This, I believe, is an actual photograph from the Battle of Chancellorsville. And these are Union soldiers. They're getting ready to go and fight. And this is probably the kind of scene that was in mind of Stephen Crane when he wrote The Red Badge of Courage, which is another story about the shortcomings of the soldier. Now, it was a very human story. If you've ever read it, it's about a soldier who runs from battle because he becomes frightened. Understandable, not necessarily admirable, but understandable. And then as he is in the back lines of the Union Army, he watches a friend of his die. And he is ashamed of his cowardice, and he goes back into battle, and he eventually redeems himself. Now, it's a very admirable story. A man, comes up short, and then he rededicates himself to his purpose, and he eventually comes out better and stronger for it. But he also leaves with a strong desire for peace. He's not a gallant adventurer. He's a man who's sick of war, and he's a very changed person. And it's a good story. It's an authentic story, but it's, again, very different from the kind of story that was told to build up and brace up people as they went out to confront the hardships of the unexplored, of the savage tribes just across the river or something like that. The world was changing. The world was filling up, and people's perspectives were changing as well. And you can really see that if you look at another work, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Now, this is from the Bing Crosby movie. I haven't seen this. Probably doesn't have a whole lot to do with the novel as written by Mark Twain. But if you've read this novel, you know it's kind of a deconstruction of the gallant knight errant, which was a very popular kind of heroic figure. It shows the modern man, the Connecticut Yankee, who makes his way in the world by his wits, who has an understanding of science, and who fights not primarily through physical strength, but through his intelligence and his use of powerful weapons. And he just sort of makes a joke out of these superstitious and backwards knights, and of course Arthur himself and Merlin and the church and all the other things that Mark Twain hated. It's not a very subtle book, especially by, well, maybe it is by modern standards, looking at some of the fiction we get today. But the point is, it's not very kind to old heroic archetypes. It gets a lot of facts wrong, especially as regards armor and some other stuff. That's not the point of the book. The book is kind of to poke fun at the old forms of heroism and masculinity, and present the Connecticut Yankee as the new option. And all of this was a culture reflecting the changes that happened through the beginning of the 1850s to roughly the turn of the century, 1900. The world, and so that's the world that the Old West is set in. And the Old West itself probably starts with the gold rush, so 1849, and again runs to the end of the century. And it takes place exclusively to the west of the Mississippi. Maybe some little parts of the story take part in, the East. Characters like the Virginian, of course, have strong histories there. But typically it takes place in the West. And this is a place where the knight type character still has a little bit of a role, but he sees the end coming. The West Coast is already settled. It's just a matter of filling up the area in between and dealing with the highway robbers and the Indians and the train robbers and any other dangers that creep up until the whole area is settled and civilized. So there's a transition from, the Knight of King Arthur's Court to the Connecticut Yankee. And the cowboy, the lawman, and the gunfighter, the heroes of the Western, they all know the West is filling up. Their time is probably going to be over soon. And they have to deal with this transition from the more idealized, idealized knight, the heroic soldier, the very capable man at arms, to the Connecticut Yankee, who is more of a tradesman who can stand up for himself if he has to, who's more a builder, who's more a man of peace with occasional conflicts than he is strictly a man of war or a man of conflict. And the Western is very interested in how those people are dealing with the changes. Are they investing themselves in the land and getting ready for the change? Are they digging in their heels and fighting against it? Are they doing it alone? Are they doing it in the company of others? That, I think, is the Western setting at its heart. The transition from a wild society to a settled one is always on the minds of characters in a Western. Now, there are other elements, of course, the American Civil War and the attendant racial tensions, and just as importantly, the attendant cultural conflicts between the South and the North, which were very different places at the time, at the antebellum America, 1830s to the 1850s. They had wildly different cultures. So those conflicts are also playing out in the South, in the West, but they are not as important as the ideas of running out of unexplored space, of transitioning from a very vigorous, almost warlike society to a very settled and staid one. And it's an interesting time. It's certainly the only time in recent memory that we have had such a place. Surely there was a time like this in Europe at some point, as the various European nations spread out and settled down. But there was probably less of a cohesive culture, and maybe the presence of other nations to be in conflict with replaced some of this feeling of slowly sliding into a static or staid world. And it's one of the things that makes the Western feel very unique. At the same time, there was the technological change that seemed to be making the world a little more impersonal, that seemed to be decreasing the role of the heroic individual in conflict and in society, again, as witnessed in the charge of the Light Brigade and in accounts of the Civil War, even the conflict between a Connecticut Yankee who was just a factory worker and a knight who was a hero of his age, is striking. And it feels a little bit like, well, there's all this progress, it's kind of demeaning people in some ways. So that's another aspect of the Western. And you have to think and balance all of those things against your character's individual motivations, their individual ways of looking at the world, their individual goals, and understand that those cultural threads are going to have to weave into their story, whether your characters accept them or not. So it's something that I had to keep in mind as I was writing Hexwood. And another problem, of course, was that I was trying to translate this genre that was set in a specific time and a specific place to another world that didn't have a lot of those touchstones to go on. So the last thing I thought about as I was thinking about the world is, could I think of a case of a story where these themes were transplanted onto a new world and yet still managed to maintain a lot of what made the Western what it was? And I eventually did. And that story was RoboCop. Now, it might sound a little strange at first, and certainly it's not a perfect analogy. Detroit was not a frontier, but it was quite lawless. It was in many ways almost as wild as the Wild West. I don't know if I would say it was as wild. of course, we have the aspects of technology. There's RoboCop himself as a wonder of technology. You have of course, the lawless nature. He is a lawman. He is restoring order. He is basically building up a civilization that was on the brink. And he has, he is a Western character. He's a lawman, that unshaking moral code, literally in his case, since it's programmed into him. And his dedication to maintaining order in what is essentially a savage frontier world. It's not a perfect translation, again, but RoboCop has a lot in common with a Western. So I went back and I watched RoboCop. I thought a lot about how I would translate the themes of a Western to a world that was not the Old West. And that, I think, is a discussion for another time. I'm going to pull a few more examples because Hexwood is a weird Western. It has elements of the supernatural and magic to it, as well as an otherworldly story. But again, that's discussion for another time. We'll leave it there today. That's all I got for you. So there's a like button and a subscribe button down below. You can use them as you see fit, and I will talk to you later.